Wars in the 21st century are increasingly unlikely to begin with a gunshot. They begin with a contract, with a memorandum of understanding, with the quiet arrival of a technical delegation carrying a scale model of a reactor, 1 to 50, alongside a PowerPoint deck and a carefully rehearsed narrative about energy security. They begin with a handshake that looks like routine economic diplomacy in a photograph, but in reality marks the start of a relationship designed to last half a century. The atom has stopped being merely an energy technology. It has become an instrument of state influence. Whoever builds reactors is not selling only concrete, steel, and turbines. They are selling fuel supply, training programs, maintenance regimes, modernization cycles, safety systems, control software, and the institutional ecosystem that makes a nuclear program function. They are selling dependency, structured, contractual, and durable. This is precisely where China entered the stage of global nuclear geopolitics with a strategy that felt unfamiliar to a world accustomed to older duopolies. For decades, the nuclear landscape was dominated by the West and Russia. American and European reactor designs helped shape the power infrastructure of numerous developing states. Russia used nuclear exports as a lever of influence across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East. China, for a long time, was positioned as an importer of nuclear know-how. It learned, copied, and adapted until the moment arrived when it stopped acting like a student and began behaving like a player. Today, the country building the world's fastest-growing nuclear reactor fleet is no longer content to keep that capability at home. It has begun exporting its own designs, less as a technical experiment and more as an extension of foreign policy. At the center of this push sits a flagship project, Hualong 1. Officially presented as safe, modern, and cost-competitive, it serves as a symbol of Chinese technological autonomy. In practice, it is also a key for entering markets where governments want nuclear power but do not want to be locked exclusively into Western or Russian systems. For states navigating a multipolar world, China positions itself as the third path, an alternative source of technology, finance, and long-term partnership. For many African countries, nuclear power has become a tempting promise. Stable electricity, reduced dependence on imported fossil fuels, industrial credibility, a kind of technological prestige, the sense of joining an elite club of modern states. Yet behind the promise sits a structure that few politicians explain in full, because it is easier to talk about sovereignty than to talk about the architecture of reliance that follows. A nuclear power plant does not end on the day it is inaugurated. That is when its political role truly begins. Fuel must be delivered continuously and predictably. Maintenance must be performed by certified teams. Safety systems require upgrades and audits. Operators must be trained, retrained, and integrated into international compliance frameworks. Waste must be managed through procedures that stretch across decades. Every one of these elements binds the recipient state to the supplier of technology, not for an election cycle, but for generations. China understands this with absolute clarity. That is why it does not sell reactors as isolated products. It sells packages marketed as energy sovereignty that, in reality, function as packages of long-term influence. Nuclear exports become geopolitical anchoring. In Africa, this strategy often comes wrapped in the language of modernization. Nuclear projects are presented as civilizational leaps, proof that a country is stepping into the future. They are also, quietly, instruments of political alignment. A state that signs a major nuclear agreement with Beijing frequently begins to behave differently in international organizations. It starts recalibrating its posture toward Western partners. It begins to treat China as a strategic pillar rather than a transactional investor. This is not conspiracy theory. It is the logic of critical infrastructure. When your power grid depends on foreign fuel, foreign service teams, and foreign technical know-how, your foreign policy can no longer be fully autonomous. Even if sovereignty remains intact on paper, flexibility shrinks in practice. Dependence may not look like occupation, but it functions like leverage. This is why the United States and the European Union have increasingly framed China's nuclear expansion as a strategic threat rather than mere commercial competition. The question is not who sells more reactors. The question is who constructs the network of energy alliances that will shape global power for decades. The West has tried to respond. Export support mechanisms have expanded. Initiatives promoting small modular reactors have been presented as an alternative to large Chinese projects. Scientific cooperation frameworks, training programs, and new financing models have emerged. Yet a structural challenge remains. China can offer a package that Western governments often cannot or will not match. Fast financing, state-backed credit guarantees, construction of accompanying infrastructure, political conditionality that is often more flexible, or at least framed as less intrusive. For developing states with massive energy deficits and limited fiscal space, that combination can be extremely persuasive. In Africa, nuclear power has become a new currency of prestige. Political leaders speak of energy sovereignty, but rarely linger on long-term costs, fuel dependence, technological asymmetry, environmental risk, institutional strain. At the same time, nuclear energy has become part of a broader global contest for influence. China builds, Russia offers its own systems, the West tries to re-enter the game, and Africa sits at the center of this triangle. That is not accidental. The continent's energy demand is growing rapidly. Its population is expanding, its industrial ambitions are rising. Yet its energy infrastructure remains constrained and in many countries unreliable. This makes Africa an ideal testing ground for the next generation of nuclear exports, both as technology and as geopolitics. There is, moreover, another dimension that never entirely disappears, even when everyone insists projects are purely civilian: the military shadow. Officially, nuclear programs in Africa are framed as peaceful development tools. Yet the atom carries inherent dual-use potential. Technical expertise, engineering cadres, fuel cycle infrastructure, institutional capacity, these can serve multiple ends. Which is why nuclear projects are never examined only by economists and energy planners. They are watched by intelligence services, security analysts, and non-proliferation institutions. A state that develops a nuclear sector becomes, automatically, a more complex actor in the landscape of international security. China knows this. In its strategic imagination, the atom is not only a source of electricity, it is a component of superpower status. Reactor exports become influence exports. Fuel exports become dependency exports. Know-how exports become a form of soft power that accumulates over time, quietly, through the routine of maintenance schedules and training pipelines. In this sense, nuclear energy has become a new kind of weapon, one that does not destroy cities, but builds long-term structures of authority. It creates leverage without sirens, pressure without troop movements, dominance without flags. And Africa has become one of the main arenas where this logic is now tested. Every signed contract draws a new line of influence. Every new reactor becomes a new foothold. Every fuel agreement opens a new channel of control. This is why this section of the story matters for understanding the broader cycle of radioactive elements. It shows that the atom does not end inside the reactor. It begins in politics, and that takes us directly toward the climax of the narrative. Because once nuclear energy becomes an influence instrument, and once raw materials become the foundations of state power, the world enters a new phase of rivalry, one increasingly described as a new Cold War of energy. There is no Berlin Wall, no Iron Curtain, no missiles facing each other across fortified borders, and yet it is becoming difficult to describe the current era in any other terms than a new Cold War. Only this time the center of gravity is not ideology. It is radioactive elements, fuel cycle architecture, and energy infrastructure. This war is not fought on staff maps. It is fought in contracts, technical standards, ports, enrichment facilities, and the quiet decisions over who supplies fuel to whom, and who will be cut off from the nuclear oxygen of a modern economy. One side is China, which has moved in 2 decades from a technology importer to a state building its own global nuclear ecosystem. The other is the West, primarily the United States and the European Union, realizing that it has lost its monopoly over shaping the future of nuclear energy. Between them stands Africa, not only as a resource supplier, but as a geopolitical maneuver space. The new nuclear Cold War began quietly. When China launched its massive domestic reactor build-out, much of the world interpreted it as internal modernization. The shift became undeniable only when Beijing began exporting its technology while simultaneously securing uranium across Africa. At that point, it was clear the project was no longer only about electrons on the grid. It was about the architecture of global power. Because nuclear power does not function like oil or gas. Oil can be bought on spot markets. Gas can be shipped by tanker. Nuclear energy requires long-term relationships, technological trust, oversight, institutional cooperation, regulatory continuity. Whoever controls nuclear systems controls networks of dependency that are extremely difficult to sever without political and economic cost. In Washington, the language of nuclear fuel supply chain security became more prominent. In Brussels, reports began warning of strategic dependence on non-Western nuclear technology. In think tanks, a new phrase gained traction: nuclear influence networks, structures of leverage built through reactor exports, fuel contracts, and training pipelines. The West responded, but its challenges were structural. It launched support programs for domestic nuclear industries. It promoted small modular reactors as a competitive alternative. It expanded cooperation initiatives with African partners, offering training, research grants, technical assistance. Yet China was not behaving like a private corporation. It was behaving like a state executing a long-horizon strategy. It could subsidize projects, extend cheaper credit, accept longer payback periods, and link nuclear deals to broader packages: ports, railways, grid infrastructure, industrial zones. That was the kind of offer the West struggled to match, and so Africa became the testing ground for a new nuclear order. For many African states, nuclear power stopped being an abstract idea and became a practical development tool. Energy shortages restrain industrialization. Blackouts destroy production. Fossil fuel imports drain budgets. Nuclear energy begins to look like an answer. But every technology choice is, inevitably, a political choice. A country signing with Beijing enters the orbit of China's fuel and service ecosystem. A country choosing Western models faces different financing conditions and regulatory expectations. Many therefore try to balance, negotiating with both sides, extracting better terms through competition. For the first time in decades, Africa is not merely an object of great power strategy. In many cases, it is learning to use its position, its uranium, its deposits, its markets, its logistical geography, as bargaining power. Yet this bargaining comes with a darker underside. Rising rivalry increases pressure to extract faster. It accelerates investment decisions. It encourages the shortening of environmental procedures and the quiet sidelining of social concerns. The atomic competition can intensify the tempo of exploitation. Meanwhile, another actor watches with growing strain: the International Atomic Energy Agency. Its mandate is to oversee peaceful nuclear use, but the scale, speed, and diversification of nuclear projects worldwide are pushing monitoring systems toward overload. The new Cold War is not about threatening to launch nuclear weapons. It is about building energy spheres of influence: who supplies fuel to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, whose technical standards will dominate future grids, whether the emerging nuclear infrastructure of the world will be Chinese, Western, or hybrid. It is a battle over technical standards that later become political standards. If reactors operate within one system, servicing is easier. If fuel comes from one source, distribution is easier to shape. If control software comes from one country, dependence becomes easier to engineer. This is soft domination. No flags on buildings, no military bases, yet real influence over critical infrastructure. Africa, in this configuration, is not merely a supplier of raw uranium. It is an emerging nuclear market. Population growth, urbanization, industrial ambitions, these translate into energy demand, and that means the contest for Africa's nuclear future has barely begun. What is most troubling is how little public debate accompanies this shift. People argue about electricity prices, climate targets, transition pathways. They speak far less about who controls nuclear fuel and what that control means politically. The new nuclear Cold War has no single front. It has thousands of contact points, mines, ports, enrichment facilities, reactors, bilateral agreements. It is dispersed, quiet, yet systemic. Its consequences will therefore be long-lived. Once nuclear infrastructure is built, it cannot be swapped out easily. Reactors operate for 40, 50, 60 years. Fuel agreements run across decades. Technical cadres are trained within specific systems. These are decisions that shape entire regions' futures, not merely their next budget cycle. Africa stands at a crossroads. It can remain a resource hinterland of the new atomic era, or it can try to become an active player, building technological competence and using great power rivalry to negotiate better terms. But any scenario requires something that has often been missing: long-term state strategy. Because the atom does not forgive improvisation. A mine built without rehabilitation planning leaves a scar for generations. A fuel contract signed without technology transfer locks independence. A piece of infrastructure built without local control turns a state into an operator of someone else's strategy. The central question then is not who will win the new nuclear Cold War. The deeper question is who will build a system that works for people, not only for graphs. Technology is not neutral. It is a tool. It can stabilize states or bind them. It can create prosperity or deepen inequality. Everything depends on who holds the steering wheel. Inside the shadow of a nuclear plant, in the cool hiss of turbines, in the precise rhythm of a reactor, there is more than electricity. There is a decision about what the world will look like in 30, 40, 50 years. Will Africa remain the raw material backend of other people's ambitions? Will it become a co-architect of the new energy era? Will the atom be a tool of emancipation or another mechanism of dependence? The elements alone will not decide. People will, through institutions, strategy, and political choices. For now, night over the mines remains calm. Convoys keep moving, ports operate without pause, reactors bring new blocks online. The world glows brighter as if energy were simply a technical matter, and only the Earth, the same Earth from which the fuel of the future was taken, remains a silent witness to the era. It remembers every shaft. It remembers every promise. It remembers every truck that left full, because unlike people, the ground does not forget. And one day, perhaps sooner than it seems, it will not be politicians and corporations asking the questions. The world will ask itself, was the future we built on the atom truly clean, or merely better hidden?